Hello students, in this video we're going to do a review of speciation. So the first question we want to ask is, what is speciation? What are species? So in biological species concept, we define species as two different populations that cannot interbreed and produce viable fertile offspring. So I'm going to write that down right here for you. Remember, you're not copying down the answers. You have to, test yourself after you watch the video and then fill in the answers after. Okay, so speciation is the event that allows two populations to become two different species. But what are species? Species are two populations that cannot interbreed, meaning they cannot, form offsprings, and form viable. Viable means these offsprings are alive, and fertile offspring. So it's really important for you to remember the offspring of the two populations. If the offspring is alive on its own, that's not good enough. This offspring has to be viable and fertile in order for us to say that these two populations are the same species. Okay, so this offspring cannot just be alive, it also has to be fertile, meaning this first generation offspring can also reproduce and have second generation offspring and third generation offspring and so on. Okay, so let's take a look at our PowerPoint that we had that we used in class. So speciation is the formation of new species. Here's a video that you can go back and watch if you would like to. We're not gonna. Okay, so what is speciation? The speciation is the formation of new species. There are three different types of speciation. We define speciation as reproductively isolated. So what it means is that when we say species are two populations that cannot interbreed and form viable and fertile offspring, what we're saying is that these two populations are reproductively isolated, meaning that they're not just physically apart, they cannot reproduce offsprings. And there are three different types of there are three different ways that we can end up having reproductive isolation between the two populations. There are three ways that this can happen. The first one is called behavioral isolation. Second one is geographic isolation. The third one is temporal isolation. So what allows, what makes two populations not being able to reproduce? So first off, what is reproductive isolation? When two organisms cannot reproduce and form fertile offspring. I'm going to change that. It should say, and form viable fertile offspring. So now, behavioral isolation, if you remember our weird video of the birds of paradise doing those bird dances and scrubbing the trees and stuff, that's behavior, right? There are a lot of courtship behavior that go on between birds and, between a lot of the other animals as well. So if you look at this picture right here, the left birds and the right birds, these are two different species of birds, and their mating dance is very different, as you can see. We should dance like that. Anyway, so behavior isolation is caused by mating behavior, the courtship differences, or even differences in the songs that the birds use to attract their mates. So if two populations have different songs or different mating behaviors, that will prevent the two populations from mating, right? And if the mating is prevented, they're not going to produce viable fertile offspring, which means they are reproductively isolated, which means they are two different species. See the sequence right here? Behavioral isolation leads to reproductive isolation, which tells us that these two populations are two different species. The next one is called geographic isolation. When two populations are geographically separated from each other, then they might end up becoming two different populations, two different species. And the reason for that is because there are many things that can happen to the two populations, right? There could be natural selection, there could be genetic drift, there could be mutations that act on the two populations separately, so that eventually the two populations are going to be adapted to their own environment. And if the environment is different, then these two populations can end up becoming two different species. So that's geographical isolation. For example, these two squirrels and these fish. The last one is called temporal isolation, meaning that if two populations breed at different times of the year, then they're not going to be able to breed, then they're not going to form viable fertile offspring, which means they're reproductively isolated, which means these are two different species. So here we go. Here's another video. That's it.